to say that this is the first of a series of meetings. We are planning to, during this webinar, to provide an introduction of the proposed version of core criterion and core evidence vocabulary. And the aim of this webinar is to collect feedback from you through GitHub, as well as during this webinar, and discuss open points. We are planning the 33 of April a webinar on the new version of core vocabulary, so that we will highly appreciate if you could provide your feedback into GitHub. And the 27th of April, we are planning to have a second webinar on CCCEV in order to tackle comments, concerns, and open issues that are will be expressed during this webinar, as well as in GitHub. So we encourage you to provide your feedback. So I pass the floor to Dimi so that he can present you, present you with the general context.
Yes. Can I maybe just interrupt here? Max Dekkers here. Also welcome to everybody. I'm going to try to moderate the event today. If I'm losing my screen, then
that's me. Okay. It's me taking over.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So as Pavlina said, and we have a full agenda. We have these three areas: the general context, the examples, and then the presentation of the new proposal. We're going to try and keep 5 minutes after each of those sessions for questions. So you're welcome to point your questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. And then at the end of the presentations, I will give the floor to people who have put in questions. We have 5-minute questions for each of those parts, so we cannot do everything in the meeting. There is a discussion session at the end of the webinar, the last 45 minutes, but it might well be that there are questions that we cannot actually answer during the webinar, and those will be taken on as usual in GitHub. So Dimi, just to go ahead, and then when you're ready with your first presentation, we'll collect some questions for you. Right, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Seth, Pavlina, and Max, for the introduction. Thank you all for joining. Before we deep dive into CCCEV, I'd like to give a bit of context in the bigger scheme of things where CCC is situated. So as you know, CCCEV is one of the SEMIC solutions that is focusing on semantic interoperability. So when you have multiple organizations trying to exchange data around a certain context, and we would, of course, we do try to standardize this information with a large focus on the meaning of data elements. So everyone knows what is really meant with a specific data element, and so it can be easily understood by all parties involved in the data transaction or in the data exchange. Now, that's why we develop a number of SEMIC solutions, and most notably the core vocabularies, of which exist a number. You see the core person, the core business, and so on. And also CCCEV, or core criterion, core evidence, vocabulary in full, is one of those solutions. These are context neutral. On the other hand, we have also application profiles such as CP's VIP or here the CAT AP, which are more focused or more designed for a particular application. So as you see, CCCEV is more context neutral, which is also why you will see today that it's more on an abstract level as some of the application profiles that we develop as well. Now, the main objective of CCCEV is to support the exchange of information between organizations, on the one hand, that define criteria and requirements, and then on the other hand, we have organizations or perhaps persons that respond to these requirements by means of structured or unstructured evidences. So you have two sides a bit of the story. On the one hand, you have the issuing authority, the authority is issuing requirements, for example, in the context of a procurement. And on the other hand, you have the tenderer who is replying to these criteria requirements by means of evidences. So these are really like the core concepts that make part of CCCEV. Now, why would we develop such a thing, such as CCCEV? Well, it has a number of benefits, of course. On the one hand, it allows the easy reuse of requirements. So it's easier, for example, to make a new tender. So because you can easily reuse requirements from old tenders because they are standardized. You can point to them in a number of different contexts. So, for example, once you have once defined a requirement that you have to be of legal age, you can easily reuse this requirement in other contexts. Another benefit is it enables the automatic response to requirements. So it's easier to make them machine readable and also thereby lowering the language barrier for cross-border processes and exchanges. Another advantage is that it can easily, more easily, I should say, assess the responses to these requirements. Also, indeed, perhaps machine readable, but also because it's better expressed in a more semantic, clear way, what is exactly required and how people can respond to this. And if they then validate or do not validate that specific criterion. And this, of course, also increases the transparency. It's way more objective. You can, my apologies, when you can objectively say, okay, no, you're not fulfilling this criterion because of this and this reason, which is why you're not fulfilling the requirement. Makes it more easy and reduces, of course, complaints that this assessment was made subjectively. Now, of course, as you might know, we had a previous version of CCCEV, version 1. Now, what was the rationale for creating a second version of CCCEV? Well, as you know, a number of parties had already implemented CCCEV and were using it, both and actually a number of member states. And we've seen there were some issues with CCCEV and also some rooms for improvement that were existing that could improve the reuse of CCCEV and also improve its functionality. Now, we've listed a number of the most important of those reasons. The first one is creating more semantically enriched requirements. In the previous version, we only had the Criterion class as the high-level class, but sometimes it wasn't necessarily necessary to have an assessment, which was part of the criterion. For example, if you only would like to request data, for example, how old is John, it's not really a criterion. So it was needed to have other requirements that were not really criterions, while at the same hand also still making it possible to define criterions, because they are also still relevant, of course. So that's why we are now proposing a more, let's say, a more general class requirement that can then be subclassed in a more semantically enriched subclass for the specific context where it is needed. This will become more clear in the examples. The one more point is that the first version was partially machine readable, but very limited. In this new version, we are adding some classes that will enhance the machine readability of the model as a whole. We also support more request response pattern. This is a bit more towards the implementation, but the first version was already putting forward quite a specific way on how to implement it. We are now broadening the scope and making it making it possible to have more ways on how you can implement the request response pattern. We can deep dive a bit more into this in the open discussion part if it is needed. It's more on a technical level. Then we have two last reasons. In the previous version, the mechanism to fulfill a requirement. So we have different scenarios on how to fulfill a requirement, different options. We have now moved this to the evidence side. You'll see in the example, this makes it way more clear from the user perspective to see, okay, in order to fulfill this requirement, I can either provide, for example, my marriage certificate or some other evidence. Will make it's easier, it's more user-friendly from the side of the user that is providing the evidences. And finally, we also made evidence a subclass of DCAT dataset. We'll get to that. I won't lift too much of the handkerchief, but this will become clear why we do this. So you'll see by inheriting from DCAT, a number of useful properties and useful associations become part of the evidence class, which has additional benefits towards the implementation. Finally, to stress, and I already did this in the beginning, CCCEV is a core vocabulary. Of course, this will have to be made more specific or more concrete in application profiles, for example, for within the domain of e-procurement, within the certis, ESPD, and also, of course, the implementation is even a level further down the concreteness axis. So you'll see the core vocabulary tries to be as context neutral and also as abstract as possible in order to allow all these different applications, because there are quite a few applications that would like to use or are reusing CCCEV, which is why sometimes you have to make some concessions and make things a bit more abstract so it can be reused across domains and across contexts. I don't think already some questions came in, Max, on this part.
No, we haven't had any questions. We have a couple of minutes if people want to raise their hand to speak up. That would be possible. Or just put your questions in the chat as we go along, and then we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. I don't see. I see Alexandros with a hand raised. Alexandros?
Hello.
Yes.
Very interesting presentation. Congratulations. I would like just to ask: is there any pilot implementations that we can that we can actually see the usage of the core vocabulary this is one question, and another question is there any classes that are reused between the CPSV and the CCEV? Thank you.
Okay. Kimi?
Yes, indeed, there are currently already a number of reusers of CCCEV. I think the ones I mentioned in the slides, wait, let me show you. So we have e-procurement, e-certis, ESPD, which are already currently using CCCEV. Of course, they are not yet reusing this version of CCCEV. We'll have to see in which ways they have to make changes to implement this version. These are already indeed known users of CCCEV. I don't know, I'm looking at Bert and others to see if there are other reusers out there. I think these are the main ones.
These are the main ones for the new version, yes. In sense of they are looking into it, yes.
Yeah. And then of course, as Seth also mentioned in the beginning, the SDG is also heavily looking into using CCCEV.
No, I mean mainly I didn't want to just be informed about pilots, but just to have an example. If we want to make some own implementations, is there available an example in GitHub or in the documentation? I mean, as a guidance, how can we use this vocabulary? That's mainly my question. Mainly refers to this, not to the information systems that are currently using CCEV, but mainly to some practical guidance of how can we use this core vocabulary. And I've heard about classes of TCAT that are reused. Is there any classes of CPSV
Can I just
that are used? Yeah.
If I may, I think it's useful to have that question, but the exact content of the new CCCEV is something that Bert is going to present later. So maybe you can leave that question for later. And the other thing, I think we put that indeed, we take that into account. I think your question for sort of a reference implementation or specific guidance for implementing it is something that that we'll put on our list to further discuss. So if that's okay, as I said, we are a little bit pressed for time, so I would suggest, Dini, that you start with the next part, the example. Go ahead.
Okay. So we made an example indeed to make it a bit more clear how the new CCCEV version works, and also how it relates to the previous version. So I'll first read out the storyline of an example, and then try to fit this into the previous version, and then next into the second version. So it's easily to see the differences and the improvements of the new version. So it's an example from the Belgian context, but I think it will apply to most European member states. So in order to marry in Belgium, you have to fulfill the requirements written down in the Belgian Civil Code as issued by the Federal Public Service of Justice. One of those requirements is that you have to be of legal age. So the government requests some sort of evidence from you that you can indeed verify, validate this requirement. Please note, this is a simplified example. As you know, there are other requirements, such as you cannot be married already, for example, or you can have specific, you can get also married if you're not 80 years of age, with approval from your parents. Please note, this is a simple example to make clear the use of CCCEV and not to make a full-fledged example of how to get married. So more specifically, in this example, you have to be equal or higher than 18 years of age. These requirements both relate to the concept of age. In order to prove this, you can, for example, provide your birth certificate or your ID card. Well, this is the side from the evidence requester, so most likely the local government. And on the other hand, we have the evidence provider, so the citizen who would like to get married, and therefore he provides his ID card, for example, not his birth certificate. This was the other option. This one is, of course, conformant to the evidence type as specified by the Belgian government. John, in this case, is 25 years of age, so his ID card supports his claim that he is an adult, and he thereby fulfills the requested information and constraint requirements that were laid out by the government. So if you would like to put the marriage registration in a process, it will look more or less like this. So on the one hand, you have the general process of registering your marriage, which John Doe starts off by sending a request to the city administration. The city administration will then select the applicable registration scenario, as there might be a number. In this case, for example, John is a Belgian citizen, so it will be a certain scenario that gets, or a certain process that gets started. They will collect the requirements and request a number of evidences from Joe. John will, of course, provide these evidences and send them back to the city administration, who will then check or assess these evidences and see if these do suffice or not. If they do not, the process starts again. If they do suffice, the official registration is prepared. John sends a notification and he can go ahead with planning his marriage. And this is the larger process that is going on. Of course, per specific requirement, you have different sub-processes going on, and we will deep dive into the one from the proof of adulthood. So it's more or less the same. John decides to marry, which kicks off indeed the first criterion. So if you get a number of requirements, one of those is a criterion that John has to be an adult. In order to prove or to criterion, there is an information requirement that needs to be supplied by John. In this case, his age. And then you can indeed, starting from the information requirement, see, okay, what are all the different options that John has to let us know that he's indeed an adult. And for example, in this case, we say you can either provide us the birth certificate or the ID card. So John, to make it, take the easiest example, John uses his ID card, puts it in the e-reader of the government, which is then checked by the local government to see if it's indeed over 18 years of age, and indeed this can be automatically done. So the official registration is prepared, it is signed, and John can go ahead with planning his wedding. So this is a bit the bigger process that is going on within the context of registering your marriage, and then more specifically, if you have to prove your adulthood. Now, how does this relate to the classes in CCCEV version 1? You see here we have the criterion that John has to be an adult. You have a more atomic requirement, the criterion requirement that he has to provide his age. And then you have, on the one hand, the evidences that John can provide to prove he is of legal age. And on the other hand, you have the evidence of John. You'll notice in a minute that this is already a difference from the new version, where we differentiate between the evidences that the government is saying that it can provide and the actual instance of the evidence. Here you see it's both the same class, but I'll come back to that in a minute. And then, of course, you have the requirement response that John is indeed of legal age. Now, writing this down in the data model of CCCEV version 1 gives you something like this. So you have the criterion, John is an adult, and then if you have two different requirement groups, which say that you have, which are necessary because you have two ways to fulfill the requirement of being of over 18 years of age. On the one hand, you have it via the birth certificate, and on the other hand, you have it via the ID card. So you see, you have to duplicate the criterion requirement in order to be able to specify that you have an or relationship between the two different requirements. And then on the other hand, we have John, who provides his evidence, being his ID card, which has a value of 25 for the age, thereby validating this requirement and satisfying the criterion as a whole. Now, we have identified to reiterate the 5 improvements that we mentioned in the beginning that are CCCEV version 2 introduces compared to CCCEV version 1. On the one hand, there is a need for broadening the application scope. You see here we always have to start from the criterion class, which might not always be necessary. If there is not really a need for an assessment, you should also be able to just specify a need to know your first name, for example. So there's a need for broadening the application scope from simply criterion to other types of requirements. On the second improvement, or second issue with the first version, is that you have a duplication of information. You see here on the one hand that you have to duplicate the criterion requirement, and there is a mix between evidence type expectations and expectations only to be supplied values. You see here the minimum value of 18 years, for example, and also the evidence type, which has to be, that you see here specified. Also, the number of values that were supported by CCCEV version 1 were quite limited. You had a number of data types that were available at your use, but they were quite limited. With the new version, we're proposing more flexibility on how you can provide more kinds of expected values. This one is also an important distinction. You see here that on the one hand, you have the government specifying the evidence in order to fulfill the criterion requirement, and on the other hand, you have the citizen providing his evidence. And now you see a bit of ambiguity between the two. You have this one, you have an evidence type, and on this hand, you have really an instantiation of an evidence. That's really one specific person with this ID card. Well, this is more the general class of all ID cards, which is more like a template, you could say, that can be provided. But by using the same class for both meanings, it's a bit of a ambiguity that is introduced within this model. So we are pulling those two apart in the new version. And finally, number 5 is enforcing machine processing capabilities as a whole. So there are a number of ways this data model can be improved to make it more machine processable, which we'll see if we present the new version. So the same process, but now adding over the classes that are introduced within the second version. You see already some major differences. For example, we introduced the class information requirement, which is one of those new subclasses of requirement that we are introducing. We're also introducing the the class evidence type list and evidence type, which I was just saying, this is the template of an evidence and also the list that someone can pick from, basically to provide his specific evidence he has most easily available. So if you were to put again these this example into the data model of CCCEV version 2, we'll now go through that and chronically show you how the data model then gets built up. So we have the same starting point. We have a criterion which is derived from a certain reference framework, in this case the Civil Code, that the balanced citizen has to fulfill. You can specify who is issuing these kinds of requirements. In this case, it's a Federal Public Service of Justice who is saying indeed you have to be an adult in order to get married. Now, in order to give an answer to this criterion, in order to prove that you're an adult, you have to provide your age, which we call the information requirement. So the government is requesting a piece of information from the citizen, in this case his age, that then the citizen has to provide in a number of different ways possible. But finally, there is also a constraint applied. So you have to provide indeed your age, but there is also the constraint that your age has to be at least 18 years. So these are all different requirements that are specified in the new version, which you see it already makes it a bit more clear exactly what is requested from the citizen. On the one hand, you have the information requirement, you have to provide the age, and you see a constraint is being applied on that requirement. It has to be 18. So it's already more semantically enriched requirements, while this was all being put in the criterion requirement class in the previous version. And these are, by the way, just the classes that are introduced in our version. It's also possible to include more others types of requirement within a specific context and within a specific application. So these concepts, these requirements both relate to the information concept of age. So this is something that can be specified, and also a concept that can be reused by different requirements. So in this case, we explain we use the concept of age. We've worked it out quite briefly, of course, but you can also give a description, for example, saying how you can calculate the age and so on, to make it even more machine readable. And this information requirement has two evidence types lists. So you can either provide your birth certificate or you can provide your ID card. So the citizen has the option to choose for which list he thinks is most easy to provide. Again, this is a simple example. It could be the case that more evidence types are required. For example, you should also provide next to his ID card, for example, I don't know, his proof that he is a Belgian citizen, for example. So you can also have multiple evidence type included within a list. But the idea is that you have to pick either list. You either pick this list or this list or this list, and then you have to provide all the evidence types that are part of that list. So this is the side of the local community or the government side. And on the other hand, we have the citizen, John Doe, who is providing his specific ID card, which is issued on a certain date and with a certain identifier, which is an evidence according to indeed the evidence type as specified by the requirement or by the evidence type. Of course, as he is using a Belgian ID card, this is indeed conformant to the evidence type specified. So he is thereby providing a value of 25, which is the value of his age, thereby fulfilling the information requirement that is requesting his age. In doing so, this evidence is then supporting indeed this constraint. On the one hand, the constraint that he is providing his age. On the other hand, the constraint that he is at least 18 years of age. So that was a bit an example how you visualizes the differences between version 1 and version 2, and using a quite easy example. I'll now give the floor to First, I'll give the floor to some questions, but then
Yeah.
after the questions, Bert will introduce it in a more general context, the data model as a whole.
We have had 2 questions in the chat. One question from Sander about evidence that isn't disclosed. And one question from Georgia, what the difference is between the criterion and the rule that is defined in CPSV. Sander, you want to say something about the case that you're thinking about?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this case. Say that the end user or whoever is running the process or who is requesting now is in the requesting evidence role. Whoever wants to check a certain requirement, say that you don't want to disclose the evidence to them directly. You don't want to. You just want them to be able to assert that a person is above legal age, for instance, but without showing the birth certificate. Could the model be applied in a context where a third party is responsible for validating the claim on behalf of somebody?
I don't think we have had that sort of the third party involvement. I think the model is flexible enough to allow the requirement, the evidence list to provide information that is not a document, but just a statement, yes or no. Is that something, Bert, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, the model is indeed flexible enough to capture this. So there will be a notion that you can provide an evidence, but more specifically a supported value that this evidence is supporting by a trusted source. And then if of course the evidence is kind of empty, but only covering the trusted source, and say, okay, this is the value and the value is true, or something like this. So I support this statement. Then you cover the case. But of course, this means the particular way of handling the answer side, the evidence side, in the way that the model supports. So there are options there, but there has to be agreed in the instantiations. So in implementation, that this is covering the case.
Okay, thank you. Then the question that Georgia had on the criterion and the rule. Is there any answer that you can give there, Bert or Dimi?
Yeah, it's indeed a good question. And the integration of CCCEV and CPSVAP is something we're definitely still looking into. Once the version is finalized, we're looking into it from both ways. CPSVAP as a reuser of CCCEV can indeed have a number of use cases. And we'll see indeed that when CCCEV is finished, what are the changes needed for CPSVAP? So it's definitely a valuable question. I think it's also something we need to look into indeed, how rule relates to criterion. The way I understood it, but please correct me if others see it differently.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the examples that you provided, it's like if you say that a person to drive a car has to have has to be 18 years old, that is a rule from my point of view, coming from the regulation, typically, okay? And then you prove it asking the driving license, okay? That will have a supported value, for example, to verify it. But the criterion, from my point of view, it's probably the legal age or something like that. There should be above a certain threshold, okay? So, I mean, there should be some kind of, I don't know if the rule is somehow a requirement, okay? So I think we needed to understand it better, this relationship between the reference framework or legal framework, which is, by the way, called in different ways in different controlled vocabularies. So here we also probably needed to harmonize our terminology, also with the relationship with the rules, and probably dividing the rules from the data and so on. And that is something that, for example, Belgium is doing, by the way.
Yeah, there's one thing, Georgia, you're absolutely right. And you also refer to a comment that Pavlina made earlier, that we're also looking into the other core vocabularies, because you're right that sometimes we use different terminology across them. And it's certainly now a good time to see whether we can align the terminology.
Yeah.
And that's certainly something that's also going to be part of the webinar on core vocabularies that'll take place in April.
That's good. Thanks.
Good.
Yeah, and just a small comment in addition to this, on the rule side and the requirements, and to see what the relationship. This is typically when we establish the examples, the gap that we see that from the procedure or the formal framework towards the requirement, that if you want to make it machine processable, then you want to end up into a very precise requirements, criterion that you can assess in a machine process. But the gap between this formal framework and the actual machine processable entity, there's a lot of room, and typically there's some hierarchy or some split out, and this is the notion where probably rule plays a role, or scenario that we have heard as well in other discussions. So,
Yeah.
so this room is to be filled.
Okay. So those were the two questions. Bert, just if you want to start presenting CCCEV 2.0.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
You see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
But now you're muted.
Okay, good, back. Okay, now, so this is where Dimitri has left us with a concrete example in the end filled in. And now we're going to step by step showing you what are the conceptual ideas and items behind this. In the first place, this is what already Dimitri already highlighted, that there are different kinds of requirements and they have different kinds of interrelationship with each other. And if you look to the model, then there has been decided to go for one generic notion requirement, which has a lot of interactions with each other, with itself mostly, and then several of subclasses, specific subclasses that aim for a particular kind of use that we have identified. So a requirement is the generic notion, any notion, any condition that you could ask to request information with. The criterion as a subclass is something that is aimed for the assessment or the evaluation. And it's typically as well meant something that is machine processable to a unit. So this is the idea that we can go to a machine processable entity. Often in procedure executions, it's not only sufficient to have something that one has to assess, but what often one as well asks just information in order to fulfill a kind of a registration form. For instance, in the marriage example, there we have, in the end, there must be a document created that this person is married with this other person. And then we need the names of those persons, and that is for information purposes, and for that is required. So it's not based on the name that the marriage will be decided yes or no. That's not an element. And then finally, and that's the other subclass that has been identified, are constraints, and that are the limitations and strict limitations that are imposed on informations that are being gathered, the information that is received, in order to meet a minimal or limit in order to be fulfilled. So this is a constraint is much more strict than a criterion, and so that sometimes there might be a discussion on what or not. So we give some high level guidance here, but so criterion is oriented to evaluation. A constraint is this has to be fulfilled, so much more strict. If we zoom in into how requirements can be interrelated with each other, then what already has been mentioned, we can derive requirements from a reference framework. This has been enlarged so that it's not only legal frameworks, but any kind of reference framework, so that the application area is a bit larger. And then we have interrelationships with requirements in themselves. So splitting going deeper and deeper and creating kind of hierarchy. This requirement has another requirement, etc. There's an ability that we sometimes the deepening the hierarchy of requirements is conditional or is subject to qualifications, and that's the high-level relationship has qualified relation, offers the ability to say, for instance, this is the requirement in the context of a member state. And so if you have a European regulation directive, and then we say this is the requirement in the context of the notion of Belgium, Spain, France, etc. So then we can use this qualified relationship. If we look deeper to the side of then what kind of a requirement can ask for information, then there's a shift has been done by splitting the expected values in terms of types versus the expected value or the supported value as an instance for evidence. So we have now evidence type as the type that can be identified as a controlled vocabulary very often to say this is the expected value for this requirement. And the evidence, the instance itself, is then conforming to this evidence type. Now, a requirement typically is not only asking for a single kind of evidence type, but might expect a combination of evidence types. And this is done via this evidence types list. So a requirement can either satisfy evidence type list 1 or evidence type list 2. And of all those evidence types lists, so what is this specification? It must be all the evidence types be satisfied. So it's an or and relationship. And that is shown now here condensed in this part of the model. If we look to the example, then we focus on the actual supplied value, the response, then to a requirement. In the example, we have this specific instance of this ID card, and that would support the age of 25 for this information concept. This is a new part of CCCEV, which is much more elaborated compared to the version 1. Namely, not only a requirement can be satisfied by an evidence in the notion of a document, but it is explicitly now can support an information concept. So instead of having this as part of the requirement, so this expected value, the notion of an information concept has been set and given its own right and its own value. And that offers a new kind of flexibility, namely that an information requirement can now ask for this information concept, and then there might be an evidence, for instance, the ID card that provides this value for this information concept. And that offers us a much clearer view where that requirement is about the high-level description about what one wants to get, and the information concept is the actual detailed description of the machine processable item that one wants to get. So this builds the bridge between the worlds of human interpretation versus the machine interpretation in a nice, clear way. As mentioned, evidence is now a subclass of data sets, and the idea there is that evidence can now act as a container, a description about data. So it's not only a document, but it can be a document, but it can be as well structured data, and this can be then shared via its distribution. So you can use then the mechanism that is available in DCAT to make this sharing of the evidence as a collection of data towards as a response to a requirement. Both this document-oriented approach and this detailed information value approach, they can be used together, as we have seen in the example. And so both can be supportive on each other, and they can be as well used independently from each other. Finally, there are some agents that play a role that in the whole CCCEV, and the blue boxes here identify two elements, namely agents that play a role in the terms of requirements and agents that play a role in the condition of evidence. And if we look then to the full CCCEV, then we have established here two relationships with agents, namely a requirement is issued by an agent. So we know who is the responsible entity for this requirement. And this evidence is about this agent. So we know that this evidence can be used to prove a requirement in the context of a procedure. So for this person or legal organization. So without going into detail of the different attributes of every entity, I hope that we have sketched the high level view of the classes, the entities, and that this gives us sufficient idea and background to see whether or not these attributes are understandable, make sense, and that the setting and the framework of CCCEV can be applied in the context that you see.
Okay, thank you, Bert. We have had a couple of questions in the chat. Some of them have already been discussed, and I don't know if they have been resolved. There was a question from Alexandros on how this CCEV can work both in information phase and in the transactional phase of the public service. Alexandros, is the discussion in the chat sufficient for you? You understand how this can be used? Alexandros?
Yes. I think the as I can understand, an alignment between CPSV and CCEV is it would be very helpful, and and this can lead to the exploitation of CCEV more in the informational phase, I think.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's a question from Sebastian, whether we foresee criteria requirements to be validated in a concrete manner in, for example, Shekel or ISO schematron. And the answer there from Pavlina was that we intend to provide all types of serialization and validation. Does that answer your question, Sebastian?
Yes, to a good extent. So I wonder also whether XML schema will be supported with saying all serializations, and whether we can expect new core person and core location schemas.
Yes, and that's well, the core vocabularies is something that we will discuss then in the other webinar. You have to take into account also that what we're talking about today is the core vocabulary. So, and a core vocabulary, for example, doesn't have any cardinalities or obligations, for example. So if you really want to check the validity of a message in a particular context, in an application profile, you would need to provide those specific things, like which kinds of things do you need, which things are mandatory, which things are repeatable. For example, the core vocabulary as such has a certain amount of flexibility that would require to add the details that are particularly of interest and necessary for your application. Any other questions? We have a couple of minutes for other questions if people want to raise their hand. Looking at the participant list here, I don't see currently any hands raised. So if not, then I thank both Dimi and Bert for the presentation. Of course, if you don't have a question now, but you're going to have a question after the meeting, of course, the GitHub is open for further discussion. We have identified a couple of things that we wanted to put forward to the group for discussions, and that could be also again in the chat, or you may want to speak up. We have identified some issues. Bert, if you can move the next one. Yes, so in the presentation that we had, and also in the example, you could see that in the model we start with the criterion and then develop the criterion into either information requirements or constraints. In the examples, of course, we try to include all those different classes, so it would be clear what they mean. The question that we had, we have discussed that already with other people. Are those steps in the flow always required? Are there cases where you could jump in directly with a constraint without actually having identified the criterion? That's the question that we have. Bert, if you want to say something about that, what we see as the options there.
So indeed, we often talk in our storylines where both all the three entities play an actual role. But and that's we sometimes hear and that items like, for instance, an information, we just request information and that's it, without connected to be a criterion to be assessed or to be minimal values having to jump over a bar or something like this. So that's then information requirement becomes on standalone. We wonder if this maybe holds only for information requirement, but maybe doesn't hold for criterion at all. And so in the sense that it's always a constraint at all. I mean, that constraint is always connected to an information requirement. So at this moment in the model, they are standalone. They are not connected, but although we speak them often in a connected fashion. So we are wondering, and on your experience and what you see, if there are always connections between some of these subclasses, or if we can refine those subclasses to a better use case. So that are the questions that we have here for the flow of requirements.
Can you go back to the slide where you had the full model?
Yep.
Where we can actually see that one.
You see here, yeah. So criterion, information requirement, and constraints, they are not related explicitly with each other. So there's no explicit relationship. They can be used independent from each other. So there's in the expression as well no relationship of the semantics of the definition currently, no dependency on each other. Maybe it is needed, maybe it's not. Maybe we leave this to the implementers. That are the questions.
Are there any comments there? Are there people who don't understand what the question is, for example? Or people who have use cases where they would not want to use all those subclasses? Anybody want to raise their hands, contribute to the... So Georgia suggests that that would be a case for specific application profiles. Do I understand it correctly, Georgia?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, honestly, I really don't know at the time being, but you know, I'm thinking, for example, to the procurement that I know better, probably. And there may be some cases where, for example, the criterion is somehow connected with the constraint, or the information requirement is somehow connected with the constraint, but I then would suggest to keep it for a possible application profile.
So
For
that would
the
mean
specific
that,
domain.
yeah, it would mean that for the core vocabulary, it's okay to have them in this way, and then it leaves the flexibility for application profiles for a particular application to choose which ones to use and how to connect them.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Are they disjoint classes? Do you think are disjoint, or since it is really open world, that they can be also
There can be joints, sense of there's not explicit disjoints made here.
Mm-hmm.
So that so they can overlap. What happens is that a bit of the discussion in the application that we often see that, for instance, a criterion, should it have an information concept or not? If people are using that, then they might decide saying, we use a pattern that we would like to have. The criterion is without the information concept. It's connected to an information requirement with the information concept, and that might be connected then to a constraint on that information concept. Okay. That's a pattern that we have seen in discussions, but that is not expressed here in the vocabulary as the only pattern.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm getting a question in the chat from Sebastian, who wants to, on this diagram, wants to question something about the fact that an evidence is a subclass of the DCAT dataset.
Yeah, thank you, Max. As you asked whether we need all these classes here. So I understood that in DCAT dataset, the new DCAT class, title and descriptions are mandatory. And I wonder whether this...
No, that's not correct. In the DCAT AP, the application profile for data portals, there are obligations.
Yeah.
There are mandatory fields. This is evidence as a subclass of DCAT dataset, which is the DCAT dataset from the core vocabulary dataset, which is also a dataset that doesn't require any fields to be used.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Didn't know.
Okay. Georgia, did you?
No, I was just saying what you said, by the way, Max. I know.
Okay. Okay. So, any more questions, observations about the criterion, information requirement, constraint being subclasses of requirements? Is that clear to people also how that works? Are there any comments on further understanding or further explanations? Especially from the people on the call that have currently implementations of CCCEV. We are trying also to find out whether this new model actually takes into account the requirements, the way they want to use CCCEV, and specifically whether this solves some of the problems that people saw with CCCEV version 1.00. Well, we're happy if people think that this is meets their expectations. Any Comments, further comments? No. So we're happy to move on to the next one. As Bert just also said, we have currently 2 agent roles in the model. Maybe we can go back to the model again to make that clear. There you see that the flow of agent is related to the requirement, because requirements are issued by an organization, that issues a procurement, for example. And there is another relationship to agent, which is that the evidence is about someone or some organization. And at the moment, those are the only 2 ones that are in the model. And we have understood, talking to people who are implementing CCC 1.0, that in certain contexts, there is a larger amount of possible roles for agents. So the core vocabulary, as we see, has this 2. That doesn't say that application profiles can add all kinds of other relationships and other roles, but we wanted to make sure that the core vocabulary meets the expectations of implementers. Any comments, any observations there? Misunderstandings? Things that you might want to have clarified? Evelien Wassenrood comments that these are the major roles. Does that mean that the only roles, or you have more roles in the Flanders implementation? Evelien?
Yes, hi Max. So these are indeed the main roles we use in Flanders, the issued by and the is about. In implementations, we use it in several models, and I don't also see the need for adding other ones, because these will probably be domain specific.
Mm-hmm. So that would, in your mind, also again be an issue for an application profile for a particular application.
Yes.
And the way that the core vocabulary is defined, it is possible, of course, to add further roles for particular applications. And there's MC with a comment that procurement might be and is provided by. Can you explain that, MC?
I just realized that for part procurement, that the evidence is sometimes not is issued by. It's always the case because it is issued. It is about someone, but in part procurement, you can have intermediaries who's providing the actual evidence. So it might be issued by someone else, but it's provided by.
Okay.
That could be as well a case. We would probably use it then in the application profile.
What we're trying to find out also is if there is a sort of a common requirement or for such a relationship, then we could also consider to put that in the core vocabulary, so that's already available for everybody, so that people wouldn't have to invent their own roles. It seems to me that is provided by for an evidence might be a useful addition to the model. Bert, comment there?
Yeah, I think that are the kinds of roles that we are looking for, in the sense that what is common kind of roles, and so there is as well a GitHub issue about this. So if you say in our domain, in our context, we have those roles, and you just apply them, we can look for it and see if there's a commonalities or a general agreement on some roles that we can align. And as well, that we can align that then with the story as well with DCAT datasets. So there's a lot of roles included in that perspective, and that we can create a common reuse of those roles and attributes in the same way, in the same intent.
And I see that there are some +1s on that suggestion from Mark Christopher. And there is another question here from Sander. He wonders whether there's really a need for symmetric predicates. So, for example, the has requirement and the is requirement of. Bert, can you tell why they're there?
That's a good observation. So from a pure semantical perspective, this is really not needed, and it would make things often easier in the sense that from semantics, in the sense of definition, we only have one direction and that we have to support, and the other direction can be used as the inverse of. What is offering open here is that those relationships where it is specified in two directions, in many contexts, the two are available. So there are groups or applications that, for instance, requirements drill down and they go down to specific cases. Or there are applications where they say, okay, we just have a bunch of requirements and we start at the one that we are, at the most bottom one, and we want to go up. And how we deal with it, and we can give it the same, have a common name for it, a common term for it. So where there are two directions, that is typically the case where we expect that the query might go often in the two directions.
Okay.
Where there's no typical preferred one. So because we always can see it. So for instance, you can see on the right-hand side, information concept. There, a supported value provides value 4. So you go from the supported value for the actual value to the information concept. But you don't have the inverse over there. Yeah.
There's a couple of them where there is an inverse, and there are some reasons for that.
Yeah. But of course,
not in general.
That's not in general. So the question is should we do it or not? It's open, because semantically the model is as strong if we do it without.
Okay. So, and if there's any further questions there, then I think there would be a possibility to further discuss that on GitHub.
Yeah.
I have another question here from Francesca Gleria about the agents, and I understand you're proposing a further agent role. Francesca, can you explain that?
I don't know if I'm proposing anything, but during this presentation, I keep thinking about the once only principle.
Yeah.
That is very important to take in. And so about the agent, for instance, I would like to ask you.
Yeah.
If you have, how are you thinking about the procedure connect with the once only principle? That means that in that case, for instance, you don't ask anything to a person, but you have to make the office of the same maybe administration that can speak each other and provide evidence through a procedure, to asking, the age, no ID, and not declaration from the person, but just a machine procedure in such a way. Yes, I was thinking from the very beginning. I was thinking about you are taking account this big change that is going to arrive.
Well, that's a good question. I think we are in this team also involved in the single digital gateway and the once only principle. So the idea is that this mechanism works in various environments. If you look at the model here, the evidence, it's not said that the evidence needs to be provided by the person, him or herself. It says just that the evidence needs to be provided to support the requirement. So the model doesn't make assumptions on that part. And as I understand the way the model is, this would immediately be applicable to the once only principle. Brett, any comments there from you?
You have worded it correctly, Max, here. Of course, in order to get the once only principle to work, a lot of decisions have to be made. A sense of, okay, you only ask once. What does that mean in an actual data exchange? So what do you know? And then do you have to re-ask or not? And how much you can re-ask? That is not subject of this model. So this model is only to ensure that we can connect the request, the requirement from coming from a setting from a reference framework, and then we have these requirements with the response. And that this can somehow create a wearable network, even
Good.
small.
Good, perfect. Thank you.
But I think maybe if I can react also to that point that Francisca is making, also supports, I think, the earlier discussion of whether there is this role of an evidence of who supplies it. Because in case it is not the person who supplies it, you might want to know in this model who is providing the evidence. So I think that supports a little bit that suggestion to have that extra role and that extra link between evidence and agent to make absolutely sure that you know at every point where the evidence came from. And that's maybe something that we need to take into account as well. Any other comments on this issue of agents? If not, then I'll suggest that we move on to the next question that we had. And that's something that we have seen that in the current model, we do not take into account temporal information. The examples are, for example, evidences that you haven't participated in a criminal activity needs to be less than 2 months old. Currently, the model doesn't include information on that. Maybe you can go back to the model and then we see if there's any questions on that, any suggestions to include that, where people think that their particular application would benefit from information in the model to identify validities, time periods that things need to be done. Are there any comments there? Mark Christopher?
Yes, I just want to say that in ESERTIS we have this information. If how long an evidence is valid, or if there is no time limit. So we have certain information already in ESERTIS. If it needs to be part of this model, it's a different question. It's just that we have this information in ESERTIS. And sometimes it's variable as well. Sometimes for some evidence, they say it's dependent on the procurement documents. We have this information.
So it might, in those cases, it might be useful. You say it's not necessarily maybe in the model. It might be useful to be able, in a requirement, to provide information.
Yes,
about
it might be possible. It might be useful, but it's as I said, we use it in ESERTIS, but yeah.
And on the other hand, in the evidence, there might be a necessity to provide information about how long the evidence remains valid, which is what Georgia says in the chat. And Georgia also says that some evidences have expiration dates. For example, an ID card is valid until a certain point in time. So
Yeah,
that,
also the driving license, I'm thinking, for
yeah,
example.
yeah.
There is, and if it is expired, it's a mess. I mean,
Yeah.
you can, I mean, they can take your car. So there are some wrong and not very nice implication, and that's why.
So there would be a possibility for an expiration date on the evidence, and a possibility, or possibly to have a validity period in the requirement for particular evidence types. Driving license are forever. Oh, that's good. In Belgium.
Oh, really? Oh, no.
So we'll need to get one there. Okay, so any more?
Yeah, the question as well to Mark Christopher. You're expressing on the requirement side in these searches, is that an expected temporal validity that should be supplied, or is that the validity period that is usually associated with this type of evidence?
That is a very good question. When I saw Georgia's comments, that to have an expiring date, I think makes a lot of sense. It's specifically for one evidence. So when we speak about the once only principle, it would, I think, to have this expiring date in the evidence, which would make a lot of sense. What we have in research is more like, how long is evidence valid? So it's more generally, but for in this kind of data model, when we speak about if you receive an evidence, I think the idea from Georgia to say to have an expiring date could be useful.
And Miguel also says that it certainly it applies to the absence of criminal records that have an expiry date. Is there also in a procurement environment a need for a date to say you have to satisfy this requirement before a certain date, or not?
You have to meet the requirement. So in the I think it's a little bit more complicated in the public procurement domain, where depending on the evidence type, you can have 3 months, you can have year, it could be defined per procurement document. So it varies greatly. But when we speak about the once only principle, I would actually more favor what Georgia and what Miguel said, to have to say, I give you this piece of information and it has a certain validity.
Yeah. And especially in cases where where it was already expired, which makes clear.
Yes, exactly. And the recipient, the one who receives the evidence, they must know if it is still valid.
Yeah.
So, and the only possibility is to have this kind of indication in the evidence to say this evidence will expire, because then we might need to approach again the person to provide an updated evidence.
Yeah. Cecile, you make that comment.
Yes, so I was thinking that it's not always that evidences have valid expiry dates. And in that case, it can be part of the requirement. So I think there are really two sides of the coin, that the requirement may express that the evidence should not be older than, whereas the evidence could say, I am expiring at. So, but I think that both sides are important to keep.
Yeah. So for example, this case, if you want to travel, that your passport needs to have 6 more months of validity, which then would be a requirement that can be evidenced. But let's see. So there's the two parts. the part where the requirement asks for some validity period on the evidence, and then on the other hand, the evidence that needs to declare what the expiry date is. Let's keep those two requirements then on our list. Bert, is that something that you would want to do?
I think that are good examples and good additions to the model that we align on those kind of basic temporal information, and that we place it in the right place of the model. We have a common approach to it.
And I see that Norman also supports that. Dietmar says that mandatory insurances are usually time limited, so that is something that that is broadly supported, I think, to look at those two parts of validity periods. So I think the answer there would be that yes, in the question that we had, people think it would be useful to have some temporal information both on the requirements and on the evidences. Any more questions on the temporal information, but also more general questions on the model that you see on the screen now? Anything that people want to ask? Have a need further clarification? Things people think are missing from the classes in the model? And again, I say, if you don't have the question now and you think about it a little bit more and you have a question after the webinar, we have the possibility for discussing further on GitHub. Sebastian, of course, you have a question? More general
thank you.
question on CC BY.
Not on the model, but on the attribution statement. I see either square vocabulary state by European Commission. Now the CCEV tells us by European Union. When I want to use CCEV reuse for national purpose, what do I have to put in the attribution name? European Union or European Commission?
Someone from the Commission said, Katlina, can you answer that question?
No, I think globally in the unit there has been, I'd say, we're discussing on coming up with, I would say, consistent phrasing. So we'll make sure to pick this up. Good point, Sebastian.
Thank you.
And to add to this, that core vocabularies are ongoing and are supported by the Digital Europe program. In that sense, since ISA Square finished, this doesn't mean that core vocabularies are not there. They are still live and under revision. And especially during the DEP program, their role is more reinforced.
Okay, that's something that we'll be looking into also in the revision of the core vocabularies. So maybe that's also an issue that we can briefly address in the webinar on the core vocabularies. Ben has a question about conditional requirements and workflows. Ben, can you explain that?
Yes, mostly wondering whether that's in scope of this data model. If you have conditional requirements, for example, if you have a handicap, then you have to fulfill other kinds of requirements than if you don't have a handicap for these kinds of things. Do I see that as different kind of evidence type lists, or is that just not really in scope of CCEV2?
There's not been a detailed analysis on the best practice for this. There are two approaches that you can have. Already one that you mentioned is, can it be handled with this evidence type list? In the sense that if this is sufficient, there is anyhow this sub-organizing has requirements, so requirements that can be chained and collected together. and that will aid us at least to handle a large amount of these conditional settings. It will be sufficient to deal with, but I'm not sure if it will be easy and straightforward. Sense of it might be that we lead to a very long chain of connected requirements and particular use of the evidence type list in order to fulfill and to express it. The best thing here is that we would have to see clear good practice examples for this.
But I think, Bert, I think that with the flexibility, as you said, of these requirements chained together, I think it's certainly possible, because in effect, this is a constraint. If you have a particular situation, a particular characteristic, then you must meet some requirements. And of course, you say, if you have very specific and very detailed, then your requirement chain might be long. And it's certainly something I think maybe then also in the future work we need to look at what also was asked earlier by Alexandros. Do we have guidelines that we might want to include some examples of these things where you only have to do things in a particular situation and then be able to picture how you would do that. But I think the model as such is so flexible that you can do that. But of course, the more complex your situation, the more complex your implementation will be. Does that answer your question, Ben?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And Cecile says that yes, this is certainly in scope. We agree with that. Any further questions? Any further discussion? We're a little bit earlier than we had planned. We had until 12 o'clock. So anything else that people want to raise, you're welcome to do that now. If not, then Seth, is there anything that you want to sort of get from the audience at this point?
Unfortunately, I had to jump. I missed a certain part as I had another parallel meeting, but based on, I would say, the discussion and the questions I've seen, I've been very happy with, I would say, the level of the discussions and the input from all of the different stakeholders.
Okay, so that I want to say that too. I think we have had, I think, quite a good overview of the work that has been done. We have had at the beginning a little overview of the general context of why we're doing this and how it fits in with the other work that ISA is doing. We've seen this elaborate example of what CCEV tries to do in terms of meeting sort of the workflows and what is needed for the data that CCEV can contain, with the further explanation and the presentation of the complete model by Bert. And we have a couple of questions there for people to further understand how it works. And then the questions at the end. I think we have a couple of things that we have seen in terms of where people think there needs to be a little bit more harmonization or alignment between CCEV and the other core vocabularies, so that we use the same terminology and that you can actually see, for example, how CCEV can interact with CPSV. I think that was a certain good point to be made. The way that CCEV can be incorporated into procedures in procurement, so how it can be used to express requirements in the informational phase and then test the evidences in the transactional phase. There is certainly something that people also need to work on in the future after the core vocabulary is ready, is that the core vocabulary actually doesn't do anything because it doesn't include obligations and cardinalities. And if you want to use the core vocabulary, you need to provide the application profile, the things that you want to achieve, and then add the details to the application profile. We have said that the core vocabulary will be published in different formats on a question that we had. So it will be done also in XML. It will be expressed in various, as usual in the core vocabularies, in various publication formats. Then we have seen that there are at least one additional agent role from the discussion that we've had on the agent roles, that we've seen that also for temporal information there is a need to look a little bit more deeper into what requirements could say about temporal validities and what evidences can do. So we'll take that away for further work in the team before the next webinar. And I think that gives us quite a lot of information for the core vocabulary. Certainly after the core vocabulary, we need to look at guidelines that could be used by implementers to create application profiles so that the core vocabulary can be applied in actual practical cases. I think that's the complete my wrap up of the meeting. That will be also taken up in the report of the meeting. And as you know, it's been recorded, so later on you can actually listen and look back at the presentations to pick up the things that you find the most interesting. For the access to the information, the specification, again, the URL here on GitHub, so you can actually have a look at the current status, and that's also where we will be publishing further developments of that. We would like you to share any feedback that you have on the model so far by the 23rd of April, so that we can incorporate them into the work that we're going to do on the model. And you can do that through GitHub, or you can do it via email, and then we will look at the next webinar, which will take place on the 27th of April. Can I hand over to Seth to do the formal closing of the meeting?
Yes. So I don't know, Pavlina, if you have some last comments, but from my point of view, again, thanks a lot for your input and participation. It allows us now to go back to the specifications and make the modifications which were suggested. Pavlina, any last?
Yes, I would like, first of all, to thank everybody for joining the meeting. I think that the information that we provided is very compact, and we will share the presentation so that you can have the time to think of your own example and your own use cases in order to make your comments into GitHub, and we will also we will create also an issue as based on the proposals, Sebastian proposals about how the abbreviation of the name of CCCEV is very interesting. We would like to receive your comments, especially if somebody of you are already using version 1 and you see some deficiencies there, in case you are using it, and we are looking forward for your comment to have it as a basis for our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, and talk to you next time.
Okay. See you all next time, and have a good lunch.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Happy Easter to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.